self does not arise from a fixed point of certainty, nor does it possess an intrinsic content that can claim objectivity. Instead, it appears as a fragmented text, thrown into the world without a preordained author. The master of the self, once thought to govern its meaning, has committed suicide, be it through existential or literal collapse. In this absence, the self is no longer a solid entity, but a discarded text, open for interpretation, exposed to the very conditions of its self-actualization. The death of the author has annihilated the bond between origin and interpretation, and so too has the master of the self eliminated itself, leaving man to reclaim authority over his own text. But this reclamation is not a straightforward path to freedom. The self, having lost its Lord, must now engage in a task of interpretation, not as a passive receiver of truths, but as an active master of its own identity. It is in this perpetual hermeneutic that the self is both formed and undone. Yet the self does not exist in isolation from the external world. It is always positioned within the horizon of the epoch, a horizon shaped by historical, social, and ideological structures. The self is thrown from the very beginning into this horizon to affirm itself within a world under which the structure constantly operates. To become a master is not to reject this horizon, but to reconfigure it in a way that allows the self to assert its autonomy while integrating the external into its own narrative. However, when the horizon of the era becomes totalizing, when it exerts a force that seeks to dominate and subsume all forms of difference, the self's capacity for interpretation begins to fracture. This is the role of the modern ideological apparatus, which, in its drive for totality, seeks to consolidate all meaning under a singular center. Whether through institutions, cultural norms, or the invisible hand of capital, the apparatus imposes its totalitarian order, demanding utter submission and reducing the self to a passive receiver of truth. The apparatus operates not only through outright repression, but through the subtler mechanisms of integration, forming a totality in which the self's autonomy is systematically annihilated. It presents itself as the ultimate arbiter of meaning, eradicating the possibility of alternative interpretations, thus reducing the self to an object within its own framework. What appears to be freedom in modernity is, in reality, a submission to the apparatus' invisible hand, where the self is no longer a subject in the process of becoming, but an artifact shaped by the ideological machinery of modernity. And yet, the apparatus is never complete. Its totality is always fractured by its own internal contradictions, by the gaps it cannot fully close. It is here that the potential for resistance emerges. The self, as an interpreter, must recognize that the apparatus, for all its powers, is inherently incomplete. The cracks in the ideological order reveal the possibility of rupture, a space in which the self can reassert its autonomy not through an escape from the apparatus, but through a radical hermeneutics of meaning that defies the apparatus' totalizing grasp. Thus, the task of the modern self is not to transcend the apparatus, but rather to resist its totality, to refuse the closure it imposes. The self must assert itself as a text that is always in the process of being rewritten, asserting its autonomy by inhabiting the very contradictions of the apparatus, breaking its unity and exposing the gaps through which new possibilities can emerge. It is in this act of hermeneutics, in its refusal to be totalized, that the self finds its freedom, not as an isolated entity, but as a partisan within the very structures in which it attempts to discover its being.